You're listening to Technomics, connecting you to insights on digital transformation and the marketplace, with your hosts Robin Ituli and Jeremy Nilsson. The hosts' opinions are their own. Enjoy the show.
Okay, we're going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, and that's retail therapy. Except we're not talking about retail therapy where you go in and you cruise the aisles. We're talking about the kind of retail therapy that makes businesses run and makes sure the infrastructure behind somebody's, target trip is not undelightful. So joining me today are Erik Bilicki and John Casebeer, who head up our retail and hospitality practice and our retail solutions architecting. So gentlemen, welcome to Technomics.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us here.
Well, I'm really excited to have this discussion today because it just brings a whole new layer of interest to think about all the many intricacies that go into what happens anytime you're processing a transaction anywhere, any kind of store. So our primary topic today is really going to be around what branch infrastructure is.
So branch infrastructure is really the foundational infrastructure that businesses can run their business on. So it's what makes those customer-facing applications, employee enablement applications, way of transacting business with your customers. It needs this foundation for you to actually run your business. So the way we define that foundational infrastructure is the wide area network. Like, how does this branch connect to the rest of the world? What is the wired and wireless infrastructure? How am I connecting all the devices that are in my branch to that network? It's the voice services. How do I get dial tone, right? It's security, and how can I provide, secure this branch from external penetrations and provide my customers that are maybe in my store with very secure, like Wi-Fi access. And then finally, it's the compute and storage infrastructure that you're running those applications, your point of sale. We have one client that's a veterinary clinic. They run Woofware on their compute and storage infrastructure in their stores. So that's the foundation infrastructure that really makes a lot of these initiatives, customer-facing, employee enablement, run.
Now, the way we tend to talk about it at Insight is as unified infrastructure. So what does that mean for us? And you rattled off just a ton of things there. So I'm curious how the scope has changed in recent years from what we meant when we said unified way back when, like 18 months ago, to what we mean when we say unified today.
Right. So what we try to help our customers with is provide what we call a unified branch infrastructure. And at its base, it's like those 5 components that I talked about. Let's provide you with a repeatable, scalable reference architecture that's already sort of 80% baked. Right. So when we talk about branches, we're talking about companies that have 100, 200, 300, up to 1,000 locations that all have a similar look and feel. They all have the same sort of business requirements. So what Insight tries to do is provide that reference architecture for them that takes care of 80% of what their business is trying to do, and we're starting at 80%. And then we're just customizing that infrastructure, that last 20% that's applicable to their business. And so we have developed reference architectures that are really driven towards the application strategy and the business strategy that companies are trying to do in their infrastructure. You got a lot of companies that have really bad applications that don't work well out in the cloud. They have to run in the store. They're tied to it. So we have architectures that will help those kinds of people build on-premise infrastructure that's really reliable. And then we have a lot of customers that their applications work fine out on the cloud, out on the internet somewhere. And we have architectures that take advantage of that and try to simplify the environment even more for them.
So when you say 80% of a lot of these things is already baked, what is comprised of that 20%?
I would say it's going to be your innovation, your differentiators, right? So if you think of the unified branch infrastructure as your blocking and tackling for the stores, the 20% is going to be what you're doing unique to that store to make it different than all the other retailers, right? So what are you doing to add value for the guest? What are you doing to add value for the associates? And what are you doing to continue to scale with new technologies?
What kind of innovation are we seeing in that slice of the spectrum right now? Where are people turning their eyes towards?
Mobile's a big one, right? So different endpoints. We talk about real-time business, so those intelligent endpoints at the end that connect back into the stores and are providing that experience with the guest. A lot of retailers are talking about RFID and different sensing technologies, so beacons and technologies there for identifying inventory, to identify how guests are interacting in the stores to support loyalty initiatives. We're looking at unified commerce, and so different ways to be able to shop and check out within the store, and then to bring the different channels into that store. So if you think of retail beyond just the traditional brick and mortar, now it's really end to end. The unified branch infrastructure can really be in any of those facilities. It's not just the traditional retail outlet.
So where are the biggest challenges? Is that with establishing the core reference architecture and getting that updated to where it needs to be given considerations like security and definable repeatable, or is it in innovation?
Well, so it's both, right? So when you look at what a traditional store or banks or any kind of organization that has hundreds of locations, the cost of keeping that infrastructure modernized and the best of breed is very expensive. So right there, a lot of these organizations kind of kick the can down the road. They can't afford to spend millions of dollars modernizing their infrastructure, and so they're kind of playing catch up. The longer you wait to refresh that infrastructure, the more outdated the technology comes, the more failures that happen. Also, in these environments, they're very difficult to manage. A lot of these organizations don't have the staff or the tools to properly manage that infrastructure. So along with things getting into life, now it's not being properly patched and maintained. Again, more breaks are happening. So all of this starts to gate some of the innovation that these companies are trying to do. They're trying to build these great new applications and customer experiences on infrastructure that's old and antiquated and prone to failure.
So prone to failure is a really important point here. And, we know that there's a cost involved in trying to abandon legacy infrastructures that aren't working for you anymore or are leaky. But what's the compelling reason why? Erik, I know you spend a lot of time working with organizations trying to look at technology as a way of both advancing and protecting. What are you hearing from those organizations about their motivation to ensure that they're protected and their systems are sound?
So the biggest thing is brand reputation, right? Brand management. If you have a security issue or it's not sound, or you have an experience fracture point, that reflects very poorly on your organization. And with social media and the way that information is spread like fire, it really takes it to a whole new level, right? So 20 years ago, if you had a bad experience, you might tell your friends and neighbors, and it was isolated. Today, you have a bad experience, and suddenly the entire world knows, and it takes on a life of its own, and it's very difficult to pull that back and recover from it. And so when we look at unified branch infrastructure and all the layers of security and what we want to do for those stores, even though we say it's blocking and tackling, it's the most fundamental, important piece of retail, because without that, you can't build onto those experiences.
So how do you keep up with the expectation on those experiences?
Well, for a retailer, part of that is you have a strategy team. You're looking out what are those trends and technologies. They partner with somebody like Insight, where we can also share those trends and technologies. You have companies like Gartner, Forrester, RIS, IHL. They all surface up different trends and technologies that retailers can look at. Additionally, consumers will give ideas, right? So if they have a bad shopping experience or they have a way to better their experience, they may talk about that on Facebook or on the retailer's site, or they'll send a letter in, or there's focus groups.
People still send letters?
They do. They do. I actually got a letter not too long ago from a customer, and I don't even work at that retailer anymore. Because, again, stuff lives out there forever, and people want to communicate. The other piece of that is, the retailers are always playing, right? Different retailers spend a chunk of their budget towards R&D, and you have folks like Amazon who are spending billions of dollars towards R&D to always innovate and make a new experience for the consumer, to make it refreshing and appealing to get you to come through their virtual door. Other retailers don't spend necessarily as much, but they rely on partners to help with that and bring kind of that vetted technology to the door. The last thing they want is to have a very stale experience where you're kind of like, ho-hum, this is great, but I really want to go somewhere else that wows me. If you think about the Millenials and that generation, they really are paying for experiences so much than just going and paying for product. And so now that's become a very integral part of that shopping experience.
Don't go away. We have a little more Technomics coming right up.
For IT professionals, it's nearly impossible to find and explore all the important business technology headlines, but it's critical to stay informed of the latest IT trends. Get IT news worth sharing and subscribe to Insight's newsletter, The Script. You'll receive weekly industry articles curated from great sources from across the web and stories on intelligent technology to keep you up to date. Visit insight.com/subscribe to sign up today.
Which presents the greater opportunity, updating legacy infrastructure or pursuing innovation?
Well, let's just say that you can pursue innovation, but if you ignore that foundational infrastructure, you're going to gate your success. So let's take a very simple example, right? Hey, I'm trying to provide a mobile application to my sales associates so they can transact business and have consultative sessions with their customers anywhere in the store. But the Wi-Fi that I've deployed in that environment is spotty and only works in the one quarter of the store. So that's just trashed that whole initiative and the experience that the customer is going to have. So the associates say, oh, I have this great app, but we have to stand over here in the front of the store for me able to transact this business. So, hey, that idea is great, and that idea was a real sexy thing that has a great ROI and it's customer facing. But if you ignore that foundational infrastructure, the likelihood of success of that initiative is poor.
So similar question, which is riskier, not handling legacy or pursuing radical innovation?
I would say not handling the legacy, right? Because that's pervasive throughout your chain. Your innovation is typically it's contained to a few stores, and you're doing duct tape and chicken wire, and it's not meant to scale. The legacy stuff is your backbone, and if that's not working, you're bringing down your entire shopping experience, right? You may not be able to check out on your POS, or you can't use Wi-Fi, and you kind of go back into the retail dark ages. So it's much riskier not to address that, and it gets more cost prohibitive, right? So if you don't address it today and you kick that can down the road, technology prices continue to change. You may expand on stores, and suddenly you're either getting kind of out of sequence and you have too many different footprints out there, or you're way outdated and you can't support new technology and your consumers are bringing better devices into the stores than you have, or you're at risk for the brand management, right? So it's the security risk, it's just the experience risk.
So we've established that the legacy infrastructure piece is, super foundational for all the reasons that you just mentioned, from a security standpoint, from an ability to innovate, to just simply maintaining the brand, which is a point that I absolutely love because I believe that brand and technology are becoming such a tremendous crossover. So how do you know that you've reached the tipping point where it's time to update your branch infrastructure?
Well, I think it all begins when you're thinking about how you're innovating in your business, whether it's retail or in a bank or whatever your customer-facing business might be, is while you're thinking of these innovative initiatives is to actually assess your infrastructure while you're doing the creative bits.
And what does that assessment involve?
So look at the business initiatives that you're doing. Try to understand, hey, if I'm trying to do this in my business, how could this infrastructure in that branch actually impact that business? 2, let me look at my current environment, right? Am I already having initiatives that are in flight that are actually failing because of some technological issue in that endpoint, right? 3, and I think something that we don't really think about is, hey, how do I pay for this? Can I actually, instead of having these massive one-time cash outlays to refresh all my stores, could I look at a subscription-based model and say, hey, instead of spending $1 million every 3 years to refresh my infrastructure, could I pay a monthly fee per store over time? So that's the third component, is to really look at how am I consuming that infrastructure. And then from there, you can start mapping out what architectures make the most sense for you, based on how you're pursuing and delivering these applications to that store. Are you putting a server there, or are you putting it out in the cloud, what have you? So take a look at that technology infrastructure assessment while you're innovating, right? Not after, right?
So whether it's the core infrastructure that's being established or reestablished, as the case may be, or doing the innovation, how much influence does an individual branch have, right? Is it a corporate versus individual retail site conversation? Like, how do bigger organizations with many, many different endpoints, if you will, how do they handle that kind of feedback?
So it's going to be different based on their operating model. For traditional retailers, they own all of their branches, and so it's much more of a push down. They'll get feedback and solicit that from the store management team and their consumers, but it's really, you have a strategy team and you're working with your line of business to map up to that strategy and say, these are the things that we need to do, here's our priorities, this is what we funded. There's other models, like with our quick serve restaurants or franchise owner-operators, where those owner-operators have a big say in their P&L. And so they'll push back and say, no, we can't pay for this right now. We have to be profitable at our own level. We're responsible for that business. And so they'll, again, kicking the can down the road and saying, we don't want to do this right now. We don't want to own that. And so at that point, it becomes more of a partnership with the corporate team and with those corporate stores and then the franchise owners as well to figure out what's going to make best for them. That's where we see the biggest disconnect when we get to kind of the enterprise infrastructure, because those franchise owners are the ones that typically lag behind because they're so focused on the profit margins and making sure their business is running that they don't want to have the big outlay of cash to get to the newest infrastructure.
Yeah, they're small businessmen. They don't have the deep pockets of an organization. So if you can give them a way to not have to pay $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 to refresh that infrastructure and say, hey, how about this about a month per month until you're out of the business? For a lot of franchisors and small business people, I think that's a much more comfortable model.
Sure. You can also see the case where some of those small business owners who are voiced back to an enterprise model might be a source of innovation. Do we see that happening as well?
You do, right? So you'll have regional market players where maybe in the Northwest they're doing something a little bit different in those markets, especially with some of these bigger retailers where they do break it out into divisions. And a lot of times they'll have their own initiative to say, go do something cool in your stores. Go figure out what's really going to drive sales. And they have these internal competitions. And that's where you get some of that organic innovation internally in retail. With these smaller businesses, absolutely, they've got to stay one step ahead, right? So they're going to use best practices that they see online with e-commerce, with Amazon, with Jet.com, with Alibaba, whatever they're doing with kind of the e-commerce piece of it, and then look at what are those best practices they can pull from other retailers. So yeah, it comes from all manners. I don't know that there's necessarily one specific template that fits.
The people in the store are the people that are closest to your customer, so they probably understand them a lot. And when we think about retail, one of the things that frustrated me, I'm from Chicago, and we used to have a great department store called Marshall Field's. And when Macy's came in and took it, I got Macy's curation, national curation, and it lost sort of that local feel. Right? So I think a lot of businesses need to pay more attention to, those store associates that are interacting with their customers every day and know what makes them happy and what the trends are locally.
You should write a letter. You're really upset about that.
I am.
This is like the second or third time we've talked about that.
I want my Marshall Field's back. Kidding. I love Macy's too. It's just different.
It's a different kind of love, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
It's not the same. It's different. It's just as good.
Yeah.
Just as good. So, I think there is, when you talk about the kind of investment that, whether you're looking at it from a corporate standpoint or from a more regional standpoint, I think everybody's looking for some sort of future proofing, which, you just can't promise. But how do we help clients make either the foundational or innovation investments really scalable for the next 5 or 10 years, since that infrastructure is so, seminal to the whole operation?
I really do think, and if you look at the market literature, that probably the number one hurdle to keeping your infrastructure refreshed is the capital involved in doing that activity. So I really think, and you see this in pretty much anything across the board, everyone's talking about, hey, can I deliver this as a service, right? And saying, hey, let's take the huge operational or capital expense costs that it takes to refresh 100 stores, finance that, the software, the hardware purchase, all the services to get that infrastructure into your store, and on top of that, hey, and as a service, also operate that for you as well, so you don't have to employ people to manage and monitor that infrastructure anymore. Give it to you as a service model, and say, hey, when it's time to do this again, 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, it's going to cost the same to do that. It's going to still cost the same amount to operate it. It's going to still costs the same amount to buy the software and hardware. So you actually see that cost since it's financed, that second time around, that monthly subscription fee that I'm providing the service to you for is going to stay the same. So now I've taken out the whole argument of saying, hey, I want to avoid that CapEx every 3 years. I say, well, hey, for 9 years, I can have the same OpEx expense per month per store in perpetuity, as long as I'm renewing that contract.
And that goes back to that franchise model or owner-operator. I mean, that really resonates well, right? So now they have something that's much more manageable on that P&L, and there's not such a pushback.
We've really tackled some of the ways that we can get over the cost, which I think is like always sort of a big pill to swallow, even no matter how much you know that you have to do it. But some of the most compelling reasons that a lot of businesses have to really go back and evaluate and standardize have to do with this issue of security, specifically customer security, right? That's really, for retailers, becomes so present in every interaction. So, there are so many examples of large organizations that have, suffered some retail losses because of various infrastructure breaches. And I'm curious how that has changed the conversation at all, or if it makes the topic of funding these projects a much easier one.
Yeah, I would say that because of the breaches, security is not such an overlooked piece, right? It used to be that security was kind of we kind of have a security practice, or we have a guy in the back office that knows about security and maybe is doing some patches. And over time, that's become more and more prevalent, and you're seeing that investment almost gets, I don't want to say over-indexed. There's a lot more visibility on security, and it gets a lot of prioritization when you're looking at, from an enterprise perspective, how do you fund that? And so with the unified branch infrastructure, I mean, that is such a huge opportunity for hackers, data thieves, that if you're using Wi-Fi or any of these endpoints that are not secured, you're opening yourselves up, not only, again, to the reputation piece of it, but there's financial pieces of that as well, right? And it becomes very expensive very quickly if you have a large breach. And so for retailers, recognizing that, and we talked about innovation, anytime you're putting in technology that maybe is not tried and true, and it's a little bit on the newer side, there's always a hesitation of, is it secured properly? Is that going to put me at risk? And then two, they just want to make sure that they're not going to leave themselves open to that lawsuit. Whether it's, again, their consumer security and information, their associate security or information, any of their IP. I mean, there's so many different ways you can look at this. It just becomes very, very prevalent in the conversation, and security really has a seat at the table now with the rest of IT and those line of business owners to say, yes, you can do this. No, you can't do this. Hey, this is how you should do that. And it's not let's do this and bring security on 2 months later to kind of figure it out.
You also have this weird thing going on where you're trying to actually open up your environment a little bit more, especially in the retail space, by offering them customer Wi-Fi. And so when you do that, say, well, am I going to buy another internet connection and overlay a whole nother wireless infrastructure over here just for my customers? Probably not. I'm going to try to figure out how can I secure the wireless in my environment and say, hey, these customers, they can only get out to the internet. Whereas if I'm an associate, I can get out to anything that's not on my corporate network. And so you have this sort of weird dynamic where you're trying to protect everything, but at the same rate, you're kind of opening up the kimono a little bit to people that aren't your employees. And I think that's why, it's so critical that, you have that security within the branch to be able to provide that flexibility without sort of compromising your whole security posture.
How do you build that in? Unified is such an important part of this security conversation, right? Because it only takes one weak link to bring the whole thing down. So how do we help customers address that challenge?
We have a reference architecture that addresses the 80%, right? And security would be one of those foundational pieces. And so as we work with our partners and to bring the best to bear in that reference architecture, that's really what John focuses on, is to make sure all these pieces are integrated and we've got the best available solution. Again, if you wanted to add additional security to something that's innovative, that's that 20% piece, then you can start looking at something like maybe a Casebeer? Kaspersky, there you go. I can never pronounce that name. Or someone along those lines that they're doing different. We had Route 9B and a few others. So that's where you can look at that from that standpoint.
So let's come back to the reference architecture, though. What are the other core components of the reference architecture? If security is in that 80%, what else accompanies it?
So there's the wide area network, which is the connectivity. Like how do you access the internet? How do you access corporate assets that are not on the branch, in the branch? There's the wireless and wired connectivity, seeing all the endpoints that are in my branch, the POS system, the phones potentially, security cameras, etc. That's how I interconnect all those devices into that environment. There's the voice, which is the overall dial tone. How can people contact the branch? How do I call out? Maybe it's overhead paging, that type of activity. There's also the security component, which we already covered, and then finally it's the servers and the storage in that environment for hosting any applications that need to be provided locally in that branch, either for performance reasons or app availability reasons. Those are the 5 components.
So what about off-prem?
The reason why we have different reference architectures is it's actually precisely because of that. So organizations, I think, when you talk about how they're delivering applications and services to that branch, there's 2 ways to do it. One, either it's hosted in their own private data center, or 2, it's out in the cloud. Alternatively, there's applications that have to sit on the site. Either they're mission critical, and I can't afford for the WAN to go down, and not being able to access that application. Maybe I can't conduct any business if the WAN goes down, if that's the case. So we have reference architectures that are built for companies that are trying to move those applications out of the branch and into either centralized data centers that they own or out into the cloud. And then you have other ones for whatever reason need to run applications locally on that site. You're probably not going to find a company that's either or. It's probably a blend of the 2.
We have some pretty fresh and innovative thinking around reference architecture for hybrid cloud. How is that factoring into the work that you're doing for retail?
Well, I think a hybrid cloud assessment will tell you which reference architecture for a unified branch infrastructure you should follow. Because the hybrid cloud is basically telling you, where should this application live? Should it live in your branch? Should it live in a data center that you own? Should it live out on the cloud? So based on how that is answered, that'll tell you, what do I have to run here in my branch? Or what do I have to access outside of my branch? And so that's really, I think, the number one driver of which reference architecture I'm going to follow for the branch infrastructure.
There's not a one-size-fits-all, is there?
No.
We wish.
So
it'd be really easy that way. Be like easy button.
Well, my philosophy is you define the spectrum, and you build a reference architecture that's on the left, a reference architecture for us on the right, and then you meet with the customer and you figure out, hey, maybe the voice component is on the right, maybe the storage is on the left, but let's make it right-sized for you. And that's the question about the 80-20, right? So 80% of it's already there. You're just trying to figure out, okay, is this on-premise or is it out on the cloud?
So really kind of becoming very simple and clear about why organizations are needing to reevaluate, update, progress towards a unified branch infrastructure. Why is it a smart business move?
Well, I think if you want to compete in this day and age, you have to be able to flex and adapt to new technologies as they come out to the market. So it's speed to market with that innovation. It's security. It's being able to provide that experience, because a fractured experience is going to have that guest walk away. And again, that does go back to the brand management. If you didn't have that, the cost to continue to upgrade your stores really gets prohibitive. It really slows down your ability to scale your enterprise and to do new concepts, right? So we see a lot of retailers want to explore and try different concept stores. If you have a flexible infrastructure like this, it allows you to do that much faster while controlling those costs.
I really think that the branch infrastructure, it enables 3 things. One, it allows you to get new capabilities to the market faster and have a high degree of confidence that it's going to work. Second of all, the new technologies that come in with some of the technologies we're looking at allows that environment to be managed and monitored in a much more simple way, in a much more flexible way. And 3, it's that infrastructure is going to be agile enough to adapt to any new things that I didn't think about when I first deployed this architecture. So that agility, it'll also bring that as well.
Very good. All right, gentlemen. Thank you so much for helping me understand branch infrastructure, how it's going to benefit organizations, improve their agility, and keep their brand management intact. Some very important takeaways with that. And until next time, thanks for joining us on Technomics.
Thanks for having us on. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Technomics. If you want to find more episodes, you can download the podcast from iTunes, Google, or your favorite podcast provider. And for more stories on intelligent technology, visit insight.com.